I sat in that courtroom and listened to my dead husband's sister tell a judge I had lost everything to slot machines and card tables. She said it with a soft voice, the kind that makes lies sound like worry. My hand stayed flat on the wooden table because I knew what was inside the binder beside me. The binder weighed almost 3 pounds. By the end of that morning, every person in that room would know which one of us had really emptied our family's bank accounts. Before I tell you what was on the first page of that binder, I want you to picture yourself in my seat. Your husband is gone. His family is suing you. A woman you once shared holidays with is staring at the judge with wet eyes, painting you as a careless widow who threw money away. Would you have stayed quiet 2 years for the right moment, or would you have shouted the truth the day they first accused you? Tell me honestly in the comments, because what I did next was not loud, but it was final. My name is Ackles, and at the time of that hearing I was 38 years old, the widow of a kind man named Daniel Brentwood, and the legal owner of a small bakery called Saltwater Bread on the east side of a coastal town I will not name. I tell you my age and my work first because my sister-in-law Marla had spent 2 years telling anyone who would listen that I was a confused, spoiled woman who had no idea how to handle money. The truth was simpler. I was the only person in that family who had ever handled money correctly. I just never said it out loud because Daniel had asked me not to embarrass his people. The morning of the first probate hearing, I woke up at 4. I made coffee in the same chipped mug Daniel had bought me on our second anniversary. I sat at our kitchen table, the same table where I used to sign loan documents for his sister and her husband, and I read through the binder one last time. There were 147 pages inside. Each page had a date, a label, and a clean copy of one document. I had organized it by year, then by category, then by amount. I had a separate tab for every excuse Marla had ever offered. I had a separate tab for every promise her husband Greg had ever broken. I had a separate tab for every text message that proved who had really stood at which slot machine. But before I tell you what was inside that binder, I have to take you back to how a woman like me ended up sitting in front of a judge being called a gambler. I met Daniel when I was 26. I was working 2 jobs back then, a morning shift at a coffee place and an evening shift at a small catering kitchen. I had moved to that coastal town with almost nothing after my mother died, and I lived above the catering kitchen in a 1-room apartment with a fold-out couch and a window that did not close all the way. Daniel walked into the coffee place one rainy Tuesday and asked for hot water with lemon. He said his throat hurt. He looked tired. He came back the next day and ordered the same thing. By the end of the month, he was bringing me books. By the end of the year, he had asked me to marry him in the parking lot of a hardware store with a ring his grandmother had left him. Daniel was a quiet man. He worked for the city as a building inspector. He was 31 when we met, the older brother of a woman named Marla and the only son of a widow named Pearl. From the very first dinner I had with his family, I felt the weather of that house. Pearl ran her kitchen like a small queen. Marla rolled her eyes at things I said. Marla's husband Greg sat back in his chair and kept asking me how much money I made at the coffee shop. Daniel held my hand under the table and squeezed it every time someone said something rude, like he was trying to take the sharpness out of the room and put it into his own palm. I should have understood something about that family on that first night, but I was 26, and I had not had a real family in years, and I wanted so badly to belong somewhere that I told myself the rude comments were nerves. I told myself Marla would warm up. I told myself Pearl just needed time. I told myself Greg was joking. None of those things turned out to be true, but I held on to those lies for over a decade, because the alternative was to admit that I had walked into a house where everyone except Daniel saw me as a free service. Daniel and I married in a small ceremony at a state park. His side of the family showed up late. Marla wore a white dress, which I noticed and chose to ignore. Greg drank too much and tried to give a speech that was really a complaint about the weather. Pearl smiled politely and said in front of 7 people that she hoped I would learn how to cook a proper roast. Daniel and I left at sunset and drove 3 hours to a small cabin we had rented for 2 nights, because that was all we could afford. He told me on the drive that his family was complicated and that he was sorry and that he would always stand between them and me. He kept that promise for 14 years. The trouble started the year he could not stand anymore. In our second year of marriage, we opened the bakery together. The idea was mine. I had been baking bread in our small kitchen for friends, and people had started buying loaves from me. Daniel believed in me before anyone else did. He took out a loan against his small inheritance from his grandmother to help me lease a tiny corner storefront. I spent 3 months scrubbing the place by myself. I picked the name Saltwater Bread because Daniel had grown up near the ocean, and it was the first phrase he ever wrote down for me as a gift. The bakery opened on a Saturday in September. We sold every loaf by noon. By the end of the first year, we had hired 2 people. By the end of the third year, we had paid back his grandmother's inheritance loan and bought the building itself. I want to be clear about who built that bakery. I built that bakery. Daniel supported me, loved me, lifted me, and kept the books straight on Sunday nights. But the recipes were mine, the hours were mine, the risk was mine. The name on the lease and then on the deed was both of ours legally, but the work that turned that building into something worth owning was almost entirely mine. I say this not to brag, but because of what happened later when Marla looked a judge in the face and said I had nothing to do with it. In the meantime, Marla and Greg lived in a slow-moving disaster. Greg had a job at a car dealership that he kept losing and getting back. Marla worked at a doctor's office in the front, then quit when she said the receptionist had looked at her wrong. They had 2 kids, my niece Hallie and my nephew Cameron, both sweet children who I loved with my whole heart. The kids were not the problem. The problem was that Marla and Greg lived like people who believed money was a weather system that came and went and had nothing to do with their choices. The first loan I ever gave Marla was for $800 3 years into our marriage. She came over crying because the electric company was about to shut off their power and the kids were going to be cold. I wrote a check that night. Daniel watched me write it and did not stop me. Marla promised with her hand on my arm that she would pay me back by the end of the month. She did not. I did not ask. A few months later, she came back for $1,000, then for $1,500. Then for $3,000 to fix the brakes on Greg's truck. Each time she promised to pay me back, each time she did not, each time I told myself she was family. Here is something I learned slowly and painfully. When you give money to family without keeping records, the money disappears but the resentment does not. Marla started to act like the loans were owed to her, not by her. If I mentioned even gently that something had not been paid back, she would get cold for a week. Pearl would call me and tell me I was being stingy and embarrassing the family. Greg would not look at me at the next dinner. Daniel would apologize quietly when we got home and I would forgive him for things he had not done. The lesson would have been simple if I had been ready to learn it. I was not ready, so I kept paying. By our 7th year of marriage, I had loaned Marla and Greg a total of $41,000 in pieces with no signed paperwork. I know it was $41,000 because I had quietly started writing down the amounts on the back of a calendar in our pantry. Daniel did not know I was tracking it. I was not tracking it to ask for the money back. I was tracking it because something deep in my body was telling me to remember. That instinct, the one that made me write numbers down on a calendar I knew Marla would never look at, is the only reason I had a binder to open in court 10 years later. In our 9th year, Greg started disappearing on weekends. Marla would call me crying about it and ask if I could come over. I would drive across town and sit on her couch and listen. She told me he was depressed. She told me he was sleeping in the car at his mother's house. She told me he was going to a friend's place to fix a boat. She never told me where he really was. I found out by accident in our 11th year of marriage when I picked up Cameron from school because Marla had a migraine and Greg was unreachable. Cameron was 9. He was buckling his seat belt in the back seat of my car. He looked out the window and said in the casual voice children use for the worst sentences that Daddy went to the casino last night and Mommy yelled because they were going to lose the house again. I almost drove into a curb. I asked Cameron very calmly what he meant by again. Cameron told me with the clear memory of a kid who has heard the same fight too many times that Daddy went to play cards a lot and that sometimes Mommy went too and that Grandma Pearl had paid the mortgage 3 times. I drove Cameron home. Hugged him and said nothing about the conversation in front of his mother. But that night, I sat on the edge of our bed and told Daniel everything. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said the sentence that became the seed of every mistake I made in the next 3 years. He said, "Please do not tell my mother that you know." I did not tell Pearl. I did not tell anyone. I did, however, start watching. I started noticing things I had been trained not to notice. I noticed that Greg always had a brand new phone. I noticed that Marla wore designer purses while crying about the electric bill. I noticed that Pearl, who lived on a fixed income, somehow always had cash to lend. I noticed that the family group chat went silent on certain weekends. And I noticed, most importantly, that every single time Marla called me asking for help, the amount she needed was almost exactly what a person might owe after a bad night at a card table. In our 12th year, Daniel started coughing. He thought it was a cold. By the time he agreed to see a doctor, the cold had been there for 4 months. The diagnosis came back on a Wednesday afternoon. Stage 3, a kind that does not give you much time even when you fight. Daniel sat in the parking lot of the hospital and cried into the steering wheel for 10 minutes. Then he wiped his face and asked me to drive. He said he did not want his mother to see him like that. We drove to a beach he had loved as a kid and we sat in the car and watched the waves until it got dark. He said, "If I die before you, please do not let them eat you alive." I told him not to talk like that. He looked at me and said, "Ackles, you have to promise me," so I promised. Daniel fought for 2 years. He worked when he could. He stayed home when he could not. He kept doing the bakery's books on Sunday nights even when his hands shook. During those 2 years, Marla came over more than she ever had in our entire marriage. At first I was grateful. I thought she was finally being a sister to him. Then I noticed the pattern. She always came when Daniel was on his pain medication, when he was sleepy and trusting, and she always left with something. Sometimes it was a check. Sometimes it was a piece of furniture from the garage. Once, she left with the keys to a small storage unit we had near the bakery, and when I asked her about it later, she said Daniel had told her she could clean it out for him. Daniel did not remember the conversation. In our 14th year of marriage, Daniel signed a new will. He did it without telling his family. He did it in the office of an attorney named Mr. Kessler, a soft-spoken man with white hair who had been recommended by our accountant. The will was simple. The bakery, the building, the house, our savings, our investments, and his life insurance all went to me. There were small specific gifts to his niece and nephew in trust until they turned 25. There was nothing for Marla. There was nothing for Greg. There was a small monthly stipend for Pearl, paid out of an account I would manage. Daniel told me the night he signed it that he loved his family but that he had watched them treat me like a stranger for 14 years, and that he was not going to leave me to defend myself with no fence around me. I held his hand and told him we did not need to talk about it. He said, "Yes, we do, because they will fight you, and you will need to remember this conversation when they do." Daniel died on a Tuesday in spring. He was 47. The bakery closed for the funeral. I stood at the front of the church and could not feel my legs. Marla read a poem she had not written. Pearl wore black and held a tissue she did not use. Greg sat in the back row and looked at his phone twice. Cameron, who was 12 by then, came up to me after the service and put his small hand in mine and said, "I am sorry, Aunt Ackles. You were the only one who ever picked me up on time." I had to walk to the bathroom so no one would see me cry the way I needed to. For 2 weeks after the funeral, I did almost nothing. I slept on Daniel's side of the bed. I ate cereal at the wrong times. I let the bakery be run by my 2 managers. I stopped answering the family group chat. On the 3rd Monday after the funeral, I got a call from Mr. Kessler. He told me in his careful voice that Marla had filed papers contesting the will. The grounds of the contest on paper were 3. First, that Daniel had been on heavy medication when he signed the will and was therefore not of sound mind. Second, that I had used my position as caretaker to influence him unduly. Third, and this was the one that almost made me drop the phone, that I had a documented and ongoing gambling problem that posed a risk to the family's assets and made me an unsuitable inheritor of the bakery and the property. I sat down on the kitchen floor and laughed out loud because the only other option was screaming. The woman whose husband had emptied their savings at card tables was now telling a court that I was the gambler. The woman who had borrowed $41,000 from me and never paid back a cent was now telling a court that I was the financial risk. I sat on that floor with the phone against my ear, and Mr. Kessler asked me gently if I was all right. I said, "Mr. Kessler, I am about to be more all right than I have ever been in my life." Then I asked him what I needed to start collecting and how soon we could meet. That was the day the binder began. I started the binder on a kitchen table that still had Daniel's coffee mug on the corner. I bought a heavy black 3-ring binder at an office supply store and a pack of plastic sleeves and a label maker. I sat down with my laptop, my old hard drive, my filing cabinet, and a shoe box from the top of the closet that I had not opened in 9 years. The shoe box had every receipt from every loan I had ever given Marla and Greg, because at some point in our 7th year of marriage, my body had told me to start saving them, and I had listened. The first tab in the binder was the loans tab. I made copies of every check I had ever written to Marla, Greg, or Pearl. I printed bank statements from the years that mattered. I made a clean spreadsheet that listed each loan, the date, the amount, the reason Marla had given me, and what she had promised in return. The total at the bottom of the spreadsheet was $63,400 over 12 years. $41,000 of that was in straight cash loans. The rest was in things I had paid for directly, like Hallie's braces, Cameron's school trip to the Capitol, 2 of Greg's truck repairs, and 3 months of their mortgage when Marla had cried on my couch about losing the house. None of it had ever been paid back. All of it was now sitting in clean labeled pages. The second tab was the bakery tab. I had every document related to the founding of Saltwater Bread. I had the original lease. I had the loan paperwork from Daniel's grandmother's inheritance. I had the receipts for the first oven, the first mixer, the first sign over the door. I had the deed to the building with both of our names on it, and the paperwork showing that the building had been paid off 6 years before Daniel got sick, with no help from any other member of his family. I had every annual tax return for the business, going back to year 1, all signed by both of us, all filed on time. I also had something Marla did not know I had. I had the original handwritten notebook where I had developed my recipes during my catering days, dated in my own handwriting with notes in the margins from years before Marla had ever met me. If anyone wanted to argue that the bakery was not mine, they would have to argue with my own ink. The third tab was the medical tab. I had every page of Daniel's medical records that I was legally allowed to share, plus letters from his oncologist, his primary care doctor, and the social worker assigned to our case. The letters all said the same thing in different words. Daniel had been sharp until almost the very end. He had handled his own medication. He had asked careful questions at every appointment. He had signed his own consent forms. He had been mentally competent the entire time. Mr. Kessler had also gotten a sworn statement from his receptionist, who had been in the room when Daniel signed the new will, confirming that Daniel had been clear, calm, alert, and completely alone in his decision. There was no caretaker manipulation. There was no medication fog. There was a man who had watched his family take from his wife for 14 years, deciding to put a wall around her before he was gone. The fourth tab was the text tab. I had so many screenshots. I had every text Marla had ever sent me asking for money. I had every text from Pearl telling me that I was being unreasonable for asking when a loan would be paid back. I had every text from Greg saying things like, "Ackles, you're a saint, I will get you back next month, I swear on the kids." I had 13 years of these messages, organized by date, labeled by sender, printed in clean black and white. There was something almost sad about reading them all in order. You could see the slow rot of how Marla had stopped pretending to be embarrassed and had started asking for money like it was a service I owed. The fifth tab was the casino tab. This was the one that took the most work and the one Marla never thought I would have. After Cameron told me about the cards in our 11th year of marriage, I had quietly started keeping a list. I noted the weekends when Greg was unreachable. I noted the days Marla called me crying about money. I noted the times I saw Greg's truck parked at one of the 2 regional casinos along the Coast Highway, on my way back from supplier runs for the bakery. After Daniel died and the contest was filed, I went further. I hired a private investigator named Ms. Lamont, a calm woman in her 50s with a steady voice, to check public surveillance footage and player rewards records, where she could legally obtain them. She also reached out to 2 former friends of Greg's who had cut him off years ago, both of whom were happy to give sworn statements about how often they had picked him up from the casino parking lot at 3 in the morning. By the time we were done, I had a tab that proved, with dates, names, and witnesses, that Greg had a player rewards card at one of the casinos that went back 9 years. There were also 2 months of records showing that Marla had her own card at the smaller casino, which she had opened under her maiden name, presumably so Pearl would not see the bills. The sixth tab was the will tab, Daniel's will, the notes from the attorney visit, the receptionist's sworn statement, a short letter Daniel had written to me in his own handwriting that I had decided not to read in court unless the judge asked. The letter said, among other things, that he was sorry he had let his family treat me like a stranger for so long, and that he was leaving me everything we had built because I was the only one who had ever built anything. The seventh tab was the small one, but it was sharp. It was a single page. It was a printed copy of a public Facebook post Marla had made 3 weeks before she filed the contest, in which she had told her friends that her brother had left her nothing, that I had brainwashed him, and that she was going to make sure I, in her exact words, learned what it felt like to lose something. The post was still up on the day of the hearing. I had a screenshot of it, dated, time-stamped, and verified by Ms. Lamont through a public records search. Marla had made my motive their motive. She had made my proof their proof. She had typed it herself. The first hearing was set for a morning in late October, almost 6 months after Daniel died. The night before, I could not sleep. I sat in the kitchen and went through the binder one more time. I straightened the tabs. I checked the page numbers. I did the thing Daniel used to do on Sunday nights when he would line up his pencils before opening the bakery's books. I missed him so much that my chest hurt. But I also felt, for the first time since the funeral, like I was about to do something he would have been proud of. I wore a charcoal gray suit. I did my hair in a low knot. I drove myself to the courthouse because I did not want anyone to see me arrive shaking. Mr. Kessler met me on the steps. He was carrying a small leather case. I was carrying the binder. He looked at the binder, then at me, and he said, "Ackles, are you sure you want to bring all of that?" I said, "Mr. Kessler, this binder is the only reason I survived the last year." He nodded, and we walked in together. Marla was already inside. She wore a navy dress. Her hair was straightened. She had a tissue ball in her hand, even though her face was dry. Pearl sat behind her in the gallery holding a rosary. Greg was not there. The official reason was that he had to work. The real reason, I would learn later, was that his lawyer had told him to stay away from cameras. Marla's attorney was a tall man named Mr. Vance, who looked at me with the polite distance of a man who had been told a lot of stories about me that were not true. The judge was a woman named Judge Clemens. She was in her 60s. She wore reading glasses on a chain. She had a calm face and a voice that did not rise. She read the petition out loud in a steady tone, and as she read the part about my supposed gambling problem, she did not look up at me, but I saw the very small movement at the corner of her mouth that suggested she had been a judge long enough to know what she was about to hear. Mr. Vance went first. He said his client had grave concerns about the validity of her brother's will. He said his client believed her brother had been, in his final months, deeply unwell and easily influenced. He said his client had reason to believe, based on, in his words, statements from family members that her brother's wife had a long history of, again in his words, irresponsible financial behavior, including significant losses at regional gambling establishments. He said this had placed the family's assets at risk, and that the will should be overturned in favor of an earlier draft which, surprise of surprises, had divided the estate evenly between Daniel and his sister. I sat very still. Mr. Kessler put his hand on the table, palm down. It was our signal. Wait. Then Marla took the stand. She wiped her eyes that were not wet. She told the judge that she loved me, she really did, but that she had watched me change after my husband got sick. She said I had started staying out at night. She said she had seen receipts in my purse from a casino on the coast. She said she had personally driven past the casino one Saturday night and seen a car that looked like mine in the parking lot. She said her brother had told her in his last weeks that he was worried about me. She said she had wanted to handle this privately, but that the size of the estate, in her words, made it her duty to come forward. She said she did not want to hurt me, she just wanted to honor her brother. Mr. Vance asked if she had any direct evidence of my gambling. Marla said yes in a soft voice. She said she had a single receipt that she had taken from my purse which she had brought to court today. Mr. Vance handed it to the judge. The judge looked at it and asked if it was the only physical evidence. Marla said yes. The judge handed it back. Then it was our turn. Mr. Kessler stood up slowly. He thanked the court. He said that he and his client wished to respond comprehensively. He said with a small dry smile that his client had been preparing a response since the day the contest had been filed. He said, "Your Honor, my client has a binder she would like to enter into the record, and she would like to do so personally if the court will allow it." Judge Clemens looked at me. She said, "Mrs. Brentwood, you may stand." I stood. My hands did not shake. I had cried so much in the last year that there was nothing left in me to spill in public. I lifted the binder from the table. I walked to the small podium in front of the judge. I opened the binder to the first tab, the loans tab, and I began. I spoke clearly. I did not raise my voice. I told the court that I had been married to Daniel for 14 years. I told the court that I had built and run our bakery and that I had records to show it. I told the court that I had loaned my sister-in-law and her husband $63,400 over 12 years, none of which had ever been repaid. I turned the first page of the binder and began to walk through them. I gave the judge the spreadsheet. I gave her the canceled checks. I gave her the bank statements. I gave her the receipts from the things I had paid for directly. I named the dates. I named the amounts. I named the reasons Marla had given me. I did not add commentary. I let the paper do the work. Marla started shaking her head. Her attorney leaned forward. The judge held up one finger and said, "Mr. Vance, you will have time. Right now I am listening." I moved to the second tab, the bakery. I gave the judge the lease. I gave her the deed. I gave her the loan from Daniel's grandmother and the proof of repayment 6 years before Daniel got sick. I gave her the tax returns. I gave her the original handwritten recipe notebook dated 9 years before I met Marla. I told her that the bakery was mine in every meaningful sense and that no member of Daniel's family had ever invested a single dollar in it. The judge took the notebook. She turned a few pages. She nodded once and put it down carefully. I moved to the third tab, the medical records, the letters from the doctors, the sworn statement from Mr. Kessler's receptionist. I read the key sentence from the receptionist's statement out loud with the judge's permission. The sentence said that on the day Daniel signed his new will, he had been alert, clear, and completely alone in his decision, and that he had told the receptionist on the way out that he was glad to have done it. I did not editorialize. I let the page sit on the bench in front of the judge. By this point, Marla was breathing through her nose like a person trying not to cry for a different reason than the one she had practiced. I moved to the fourth tab, the texts. I told the judge that I had 13 years of messages between me and Marla, all related to money, all preserved with dates and times. I gave her a printed sample of the most relevant 50 pages. I read 3 short ones out loud. The first was Marla asking me in plain language for $2,000 to cover, in her words, a gambling debt of Greg's that he was hiding from his mother. The second was Pearl writing to me, a year later, telling me that I should be ashamed of myself for asking when a previous loan would be paid back. The third was Greg writing to me, in our 12th year, saying in his words, "Ackles, you are the only one who ever helps. I will pay you when the casino night turns around. I swear on the kids." I did not raise my voice on that last one. The judge read it on the page after I read it out loud. She looked up at Marla. Marla looked at the floor. I moved to the fifth tab, the casino tab. This was the one I had practiced the most. I told the judge that I had hired a licensed private investigator named Ms. Lamont to verify, through legal channels, the gambling history of certain members of the family. I gave the judge Ms. Lamont's report. I gave her the player rewards records that showed Greg had been a regular at one casino for 9 years. I gave her the second card under Marla's maiden name at a different casino. I gave her the sworn statements from 2 of Greg's former friends, both of whom had picked high up from the parking lot at 3 in the morning more times than they could count. Marla's lawyer stood up. He said, "Your Honor, my client is not on trial here." The judge looked at him over her glasses and said, "Mr. Vance, your client opened a door. Sit down." He sat down. I moved to the 6th tab, the will. I gave the judge the original will. I gave her the notes from the attorney visit. I gave her the sworn statement of the receptionist again in a clean copy. I did not read Daniel's letter. I had decided that morning that the letter belonged to me, not the courtroom. I would only use it if I was forced to. I moved to the 7th tab, the Facebook post. I told the judge that 3 weeks before this contest had been filed, Marla had publicly posted on her own social media account that she was going to make me, in her exact words, learn what it felt like to lose something. I gave the judge the dated screenshot. I gave her the verification report from Ms. Lamont confirming the post and its timing. I told her plainly that I was not the gambler and that this case was not about my husband's competence. I told her this case was about a woman who had spent 12 years borrowing money from me, who had watched her husband empty their family's savings at card tables, and who, when her brother had finally drawn a line around me on his way out of this world, had decided to call me a gambler in public so that nobody would notice who the real one was. Then I closed the binder. The room was quiet. Marla was crying for real now. Pearl had stopped fingering her rosary. Mr. Vance was looking down at his notes like they had betrayed him. Judge Clemens sat very still for a long moment. Then she took off her glasses, set them on the bench, and said in her steady, calm voice, "Mrs. Brentwood, please be seated." I sat. My legs felt strange, like they had been holding me up for years and had only just been told they could rest. Mr. Kessler put his hand on my arm under the table and squeezed it once, just once, the way Daniel used to squeeze my hand at family dinners. The judge addressed the court. She said she was going to take a short recess to review the materials I had submitted. She said she would return in 30 minutes with her preliminary findings. Then she rose and the bailiff said, "All rise," and Marla looked at me from across the room with an expression I had not seen on her face in 14 years. It was not anger, it was not sorrow. It was the dull, blank expression of a person who had finally understood that the story she had been telling herself about her own life was not the story other people were going to tell. In the hallway, Mr. Kessler bought me a paper cup of water from a vending machine. I drank it slowly. He told me that I had done the hardest part. I told him I did not feel relief yet. He said, "You will, just not today." Marla tried to approach me in the hallway. Her lawyer caught her elbow and walked her in the other direction. Pearl sat on a bench and stared at the wall. I noticed for the first time that she looked old. She looked like a woman who had spent a lifetime defending the wrong people. When the judge came back, the room was full again. She put her glasses on, opened the binder I had given her, and addressed the court. She said that the evidence presented by the petitioner, which was the receipt Marla had brought, was insufficient to support the central claim of her petition. She said that the evidence presented by the respondent, which was me, was, in her words, comprehensive, organized, and overwhelming. She said that she found no evidence whatsoever that I had a gambling problem. She said that the medical records and the witness statement clearly established that Daniel had been mentally competent at the time he signed his will. She said that the bakery was, by all available documentation, mine, and had been since before Daniel's illness. She said that the loans I had given to Marla and Greg were a matter of formal record and could be pursued in a separate civil action if I chose. She said that the Facebook post was, in her words, deeply troubling, as it suggested that the petitioner had filed this contest with personal animosity rather than legitimate concern. She said she was dismissing the contest with prejudice. She said she was awarding me legal fees. She said that if any further frivolous action was filed against me by the same petitioner, she would consider sanctions. She said all of this without raising her voice once. Then she banged her gavel softly and it was over. Marla made a sound in the back of her throat that did not have a word for it. Pearl put her hand on her daughter's back. Mr. Vance gathered his papers. Mr. Kessler stood up, smiled at me, and said, "Ackles, let us go get lunch." I did not go to lunch right away. I walked out of the courthouse alone into the bright, cold October air, and I sat on the steps for 10 minutes and let the wind go through my hair. I thought out Daniel in the parking lot of the hospital asking me to promise. I thought about Cameron in the back seat of my car telling me about the cards. I thought about my own younger self, scrubbing the floors of an empty corner storefront, dreaming of a place called Saltwater Bread. I thought about the 2 pounds of paper sitting in the binder on my lap, and I thought about how silence had finally turned into something heavier than noise. Then Mr. Kessler came down the steps and we went to lunch. The aftermath of that hearing was not loud. It was slow and small and steady, and that is how I knew it was real. 2 weeks after the dismissal, I received a long email from Pearl. It was the longest email she had ever sent me. She wrote about her late husband. She wrote about how hard it had been to raise Daniel and Marla on her own. She wrote about how she had always tried to protect Marla because Marla, in her words, had been the more fragile child. She wrote that she was sorry, in her own way, for the things she had said to me over the years. She did not directly apologize for telling me I was being stingy. She did not directly apologize for telling me to learn to cook a proper roast. She did not directly apologize for sitting behind Marla in court and holding a rosary while her daughter accused me of gambling. But near the end of the email, she wrote one sentence that stopped me. She wrote, "Daniel told me once before he got sick that you were the only person in this family who had ever told him the truth without making him feel small for hearing it." She said she wished she had understood what he meant before it was too late. I read that email 3 times. I sat with it for 2 days, then I wrote back. I told Pearl that I did not have any anger left for her. I told her that I forgave her for the small cruelties of 14 years. I told her that I would continue the small monthly stipend that Daniel had set up in his will because that was what he had wanted. But I told her plainly that I would not be at family dinners anymore. I told her that I would send her a card on her birthday and Christmas. I told her that if she ever needed help, she could call me and I would help her the way I would help any old woman who had been kind to me. But I told her that I was no longer her daughter-in-law in any practical sense because Daniel was gone and the house she lived in was not the same house anymore. I sent the email. She did not respond for 3 weeks. Then she sent back 2 lines. She wrote, "I understand and I am sorry and I love you, Ackles." That was the last email I ever got from her. Marla did not contact me for almost a year. When she did, it was through a different lawyer, quieter one, asking if there was any way to settle the loan amounts privately rather than through a civil action. I had not yet decided whether to file the civil action. I had been busy running the bakery, which had grown again that year, and I had been spending a lot of my evenings on a porch I had never sat on before, watching the sky change colors. I read the new lawyer's letter twice. I thought about Cameron, who was now 13, and Hallie, who was now 16, and how their lives would be affected if I pursued the full $63,400 from their mother. I made a decision that surprised me. I wrote back through Mr. Kessler that I would forgive $40,000 of the debt entirely. I would require the remaining $23,400 to be repaid over 5 years in monthly installments with no interest. The condition was that Marla had to sign a notarized statement acknowledging the debt, and that any missed payment would convert the entire remaining balance into a civil judgment. I added a second condition. The first thing she had to do before any money changed hands was to take down the Facebook post in which she had said I had brainwashed her brother and that she was going to make me lose something. The post had to come down and a brief correction had to go up in its place, written in her own words, acknowledging that her accusations had been false and that the court had ruled against her. Marla signed everything within a week. The post came down within 2 days. The correction went up. It was short. It said in her own words that she had been wrong about her brother's wife, that the court had ruled in her brother's wife's favor, and that she was sorry for what she had said. It got 6 likes. 3 of them were from people who had been sitting in that courtroom. Greg did not contact me at all. I heard through a friend of a friend that he had finally entered a treatment program for gambling addiction about a year after the hearing. I heard that Marla had moved with the kids into a smaller apartment near her mother. I heard that Cameron, my nephew, had asked his mother once whether Aunt Ackles still loved him, and that Marla had told him yes, even though she could not look at H. I am while she said it. I started taking Cameron and Hallie out for lunch on the last Sunday of every month. It was something I decided to do without asking anyone's permission. I picked them up at the corner of their building. I drove them to a diner near the coast. I bought them whatever they wanted. I asked them about school and friends and books and small dreams. I never said a single word about their parents. I never said a single word about the court case. I never told them why their Uncle Daniel had wanted me to keep the bakery. I just kept showing up at the corner on the last Sunday of every month, the way I wish someone had shown up for me when I was their age. Cameron stopped asking questions about his father after a few months. Hallie started telling me she wanted to be a baker. I told her she had a job whenever she wanted one. She laughed and said she would think about it. I think she will say yes one day. The bakery did well. We opened a second location in our 19th year, which would have been our 19th wedding anniversary. I named the second one Daniel's. I kept the original saltwater bread sign exactly the way it had been when Daniel first hung it. I kept his handwriting on the chalkboard inside. I kept the same coffee mug at the cash register. I never married again. I do not say that with sadness. I say it with the calm of a woman who has loved the right person once and does not need to prove anything by trying to do it again. I keep the binder in the bottom drawer of my desk in the back office of the original bakery. I do not look at it often, I do not need to, it served its purpose. But sometimes on quiet Sunday nights when I am closing the books the way Daniel used to close them, I open the drawer and I look at the binder and I remember the woman who built it. She was tired, she was grieving, she was alone, she had been silent for 14 years. She had been called a gambler in front of a judge by a woman she had loaned $63,400. And she had walked into that courtroom with 2 pounds of paper and a steady voice, and she had told the truth. I want to tell you something I have learned, and I want you to hear it the way I needed to hear it. When you give without records, people forget. When you forgive without limits, people repeat. When you stay silent to keep the peace is never yours, it is theirs, and it is built on the ground of your back. The kindest thing you can do for a family that has been using you is not to scream at them. It is to write down what they have done calmly and clearly and to keep that record somewhere safe, not because you plan to use it, because one day you may need to. I did not become a different person after that hearing. I became the person Daniel had always seen. The person Cameron in the back seat of my car at 9 years old had assumed I already was. The person my mother, before she died, had told me I would have to fight to stay. I became a woman who knew what she had built, who knew what she had been owed, and who did not need to shout in order to be believed, because she had already done the quiet work. In the months after the dismissal, the bakery felt different. It felt like mine in a way it had not felt before, even though it had always been mine in every legal sense. The morning shifts felt lighter. The coffee tasted better. Hallie called me on a random Tuesday and asked if she could come help on Saturday. I said yes. She showed up at 6 in the morning in an apron that was too big for her, and she rolled out her first batch of dough next to me, and she did not say a single word for an hour, and that was the most peaceful Saturday morning I had had since Daniel died. When her shift ended, she hugged me and she said, "Aunt Ackles, I am sorry for what my mom did." I told her she did not need to be sorry for any of it. She is not her mother. She is a girl who showed up at 6 in the morning to learn from her aunt. That is enough for a whole lifetime. Cameron, the boy who told me about the cards, started writing me letters. Real letters on paper, the kind that come in envelopes with stamps. He told me about a girl he liked, but only as a friend. He told me about a teacher he hated, then later about the same teacher he had come to respect. He told me he had read a book about a man who builds bridges in places where there had only ever been rivers. He told me he wanted to do something like that one day. He never asked me for money, he never mentioned his father. He just wrote and I wrote back, and a year of letters sat in my desk drawer next to the binder, and I think anyone who ever looks in that drawer will understand what I valued. There were small reckonings I did not expect. About a year after the hearing, I ran into Mr. Vance, Marla's lawyer, at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He recognized me. He looked uncomfortable. He came over with his cup in his hand and he said, "Mrs. Brentwood M." I sit for a minute. I said yes. He sat down and he said that he had been a lawyer for 30 years and that he had handled many family contests and that he had never seen anyone walk into a courtroom as prepared as I had. He said he had told his client more than once to drop the case before it went to a hearing, but that she had refused. He said he was sorry he had stood up in court and read what he had read. I told him he had been doing his job. He asked if there was anything he could do to make it right. I thought about it for a moment and I said, "Mr. Vance, you can be honest with the next client who walks into your office and lies to you. You can ask them harder questions. You can tell them no when they need to hear no." He nodded. He said he would try. He left a generous tip on the table for the barista before he left. Pearl died about 3 years after the hearing. It was sudden, a stroke in her sleep. I was not in the room when she died. I was in the bakery kneading dough when my phone rang. It was Marla. Her voice was small. She told me Mama had passed in the night. She asked if I would come to the funeral. I went. I sat in the back. I wore a dark blue dress, not black, because Daniel had hated me in black. I listened to a pastor talk about Pearl as a woman of faith. I listened to Marla try to give a eulogy and fail. Sit down and let Hallie finish it for her. After the service, I walked up to the coffin and put my hand on the wood and I said quietly, "Thank you for raising Daniel. I am sorry we never figured out how to be each other's family." I went home that night and I sat in the kitchen and I cried, not for Pearl exactly, but for the long sad weight of how much love had been wasted in that family, because none of them had known what to do with mine. After Pearl's funeral, Marla asked if she could meet with me alone in a public place just to talk. I agreed. We met at the diner where I took the kids on Sundays. We sat in a booth near the window. She did not cry. She did not perform. She told me she had spent the last 3 years trying to understand why she had done what she had done. She said she thought for a long time that she had been protecting her family. She said she had finally come to realize that the family she thought she was protecting did not really exist, because her own family, the one she had built with Greg, had been quietly drowning while she pretended to be the older sister. She said she was not asking me to forgive her. She just wanted me to know that she had finally stopped lying to herself. I listened. When she was done, I told her I had forgiven her years ago, but that forgiveness was not the same as access. I told her I would keep showing up for her kids. I told her I would not be at her birthday dinners. I told her I wished her well. I paid for both of our coffees. I stood up. I walked out into the parking lot. I drove home. I never met her alone again, but I did not need to. Some endings happen without ceremony. Greg I never spoke to again. I heard when Cameron was about 16 that Greg had relapsed once but had pulled himself back. I heard a few years after that he was working as a service writer at a small auto shop and had been sober for a long time. I was glad to hear it in the abstract way you are glad to hear that a stranger has stopped hurting people. He never wrote to me, he never called. I think in some quiet corner of his pride he knew that he could not afford to look me in the eye. That was all right with me. The world is full of conversations that do not need to happen. The repayment from Marla came in steady monthly amounts for 5 years. Some months were small, $50 or $100. Some months were larger, she never missed a single one. The last payment came in on a cold January morning. I opened the envelope at the kitchen table. It was $120 and a short note. The note said, "This is the last one, thank you, I hope this finds you well, Marla." I put the check in the bank that afternoon. I bought a small bouquet of yellow flowers on the way home and I put them on the kitchen table next to Daniel's mug. That night, I sat in the kitchen for a long time thinking about how a debt that had taken 12 years to grow had taken 5 years to settle, and how there was a kind of justice in that ratio that no court could have arranged. The bakery is now a small chain of 4 locations along the coast. We have 18 employees. We give away unsold bread every night to a shelter and a school. Hallie runs the second location, the one named after Daniel. Cameron is in college, studying engineering on a scholarship he earned without help from anyone. He calls me every Sunday night. We talk about bridges and rivers and recipes and weather. He does not call his mother every Sunday night, though he does call her often enough. That is between them. I am his aunt. I am not his mother. I have never tried to be. I am in my early 50s now. I have gray streaks in my hair that I do not dye. I sleep on Daniel's side of the bed because at some point it stopped being his side and started being the side closest to the window. I have a dog named Biscuit. I have a small garden behind the original bakery where I grow tomatoes for the kitchen. I have peace. The kind of peace that does not need to be defended every day because it was earned through one long, quiet act of record-keeping and through one calm morning in a courtroom when I told the truth out loud. I want to tell you plainly why I am telling you this story now. I am telling you because there are women out there right now sitting at kitchen tables wondering if they should keep saying yes to people who keep using them, wondering if it is mean to write down the loan amount, wondering if it is paranoid to keep the receipts, wondering if their silence is keeping the peace or paying for it. I am telling you to keep the receipts. I am telling you to write down the amounts. I am telling you to label the texts. I am telling you that the most powerful sentence a kind woman can ever say is the truth, said calmly, with paper to back it up. I am telling you because the people who use you will always tell a story about you when they finally get caught. They will say you changed. They will say you were always strange. They will say you are doing this for the money. They will say you are bitter. They will say things like she just wants attention or she always thought she was better than us. They will tell that story loudly because the louder they tell it, the less they have to hear the quiet truth of who they actually are. Let them tell it. Let them shout it from the back of the church. While they are shouting, you organize your binder, you label your tabs, you date your screenshots. And you wait for the day when a calm woman in a black robe asks you to stand and to speak, and you do, and the room goes quiet because the truth, when it finally arrives, does not need to be loud. I'm telling you because Daniel asked me in a hospital parking lot at sunset not to let them eat me alive. And I did not. They tried. They came with lawyers and lies and a soft voice and a tissue. They tried to tell a judge that the woman who had built our bakery and saved their family 3 times over was a careless gambler who deserved to lose everything. They told that story because they thought I would not have a story of my own. They thought silence meant I had nothing to say. They were wrong. I had been listening for 14 years. I had been writing down amounts on the back of a calendar in our pantry. I had been saving every check stub. I had been keeping every text. I had been the dependable one, but I had also been awake the whole time. They mistook my kindness for blindness. The binder was the proof that I had seen everything. If Daniel could read this somehow, I think he would smile. I think he would be glad I kept the bakery. I think he would be glad I did not become bitter, and I think he would be especially glad that I did not become small. I think he would be glad that Cameron writes me letters, that Hallie wants to be a baker, that Pearl said sorry in her own broken way before the end, that Marla finally signed a paper acknowledging the truth. I think he would be glad that I sat on the courthouse steps that October morning alone and did not feel ashamed. I think he would be glad that the binder still sits in my desk drawer unopened but ready, because peace is not the absence of trouble. Peace is what you build when you have written everything down and you know that if trouble ever comes again, you will not be the one who is unprepared. I want to tell you one last small thing before I let you go. The night after the hearing, after Mr. Kessler bought me lunch, after I drove home through the bright fall light, after I let Biscuit out into the backyard and watched her chase a leaf around in a circle, I went into our bedroom and I opened Daniel's nightstand drawer for the first time since he had died. I had not been able to do it before. Inside the drawer was a small folded note, tucked under a copy of his favorite book. The note had my name on it. It was written in his handwriting. It said, "If you are reading this, it means you finally did something brave that you were afraid to do, and I am proud of you. I do not know which thing it will be, I just know you will do it. I love you, Ackles." I sat on the edge of the bed and I read that note 3 times. Then I folded it back up. Then I put it in the binder in the back in a clean plastic sleeve behind the last tab, where it belongs. If you have ever been the dependable one in your family, the one who helps without records, the one who pays without questions, the one who carries everyone else through their bad decisions and gets called selfish the first time you set a small boundary, I want you to do something for me. Tell me in the comment. In TS, what is one quiet thing you wish you had started writing down years ago? It can be a loan, a promise, a missed call, a moment someone said something they later denied. Just one thing. Other people who read your comment will see it, and someone tonight will sit at her kitchen table, hear about your one thing, and decide to start her own binder. That is how women like Ackles take their lives back, one labeled tab at a time. I will be reading every comment.